My name is Maddie Jolstrom, and I'm the Executive Director of the Nantucket Book Festival. And on behalf of our committee, I am delighted to welcome you to our 6th annual Nantucket Book Festival. We thank you for being here because we wouldn't be here if you didn't keep coming back every year. We'd also like to thank our generous supporters who make it possible for all of our events, or almost all of our events, to be free and open to our community and to visitors to Nantucket. We'd especially like to thank Nantucket Island Resorts and Jill and Stephen Karp, Wendy Schmidt, the Nantucket Athenaeum, the Inquirer and Mirror, WCAI, N Magazine, Haft Productions, the Nantucket Historical Association, and the Dreamland Theater. Would you please join me in thanking our generous sponsors? The year-round work of the Book Foundation, which includes the Book Festival, would not be possible if not for you, for your loyalty, and for attending and supporting us each year. So if you would like to contribute to us, we have donation boxes in the back, or you can visit our website, nantucketbookfestival.org. We also have these comment cards in the back that tell you about the new app that we have for our festival, and we'd love to have your email address so that we can keep you updated on what's going on with the festival year-round. Now, after today's presentation, Laurie will be downstairs signing her books. So if you would like her to sign a book, we encourage you to go out through that right-hand door next to the mirror. And if you are not getting a book signed, you can leave via the side door, and that keeps the traffic moving a little more smoothly. So at this time, please silence your cell phones. And now, I'd like to say just a few words about Laurie. I have worked in the world of books for 18 years, and can honestly say that my happiest moments are when I discover that an author whose work I love to read is a wonderful human being as well. I first met Laurie when we both lived in Pennsylvania, and she was writing books in longhand in the Barnes & Noble where I worked. She was kind, funny, smart, generous, and starting to make a name for herself in children's literature. And then came her novel, Speak. And I don't think Laurie has had a chance to sit down and relax ever since. But I am happy to say that she is still the same wonderful person I knew a dozen years ago. When we greeted each other yesterday after she arrived, her first words to me were, "How can I help you? What do you need?" It's a pleasure to introduce Laurie and her equally adorable husband, Scott, to the avid readers of Nantucket, and I know you will give her a warm welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, Laurie Halse Anderson.
Good afternoon. I'm a preacher's kid. I'm a preacher's kid from old Yankee stock, so to be standing here, I can feel my Father's presence within me, right? So if I start testifying, you are my amen corner, my friends. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Maddie. I mean, it's amazing what life brings, isn't it? If anybody had told me when I was a rather confused 14-year-old that this amazing life I've had with the wandering path that keeps on looping back on itself in friendship and kindness, I would have said, you are so screwed up. And yet here I am. So thank you very much to this incredible community on the island, to the sponsors and to the donors and the summer people and just everyone who's bringing this community of readers and storytellers and story lovers together. I do want to take a moment. I hope you all in your hearts can have some room. There apparently was a ferry accident last night. And that just is making me sad. Some people were injured, they're being treated. And so just, hold space for them in your spirit today and their families. I'm going to be talking very frankly, because I'm, a Yankee, right? We don't mess around. And some of the things that I'll be talking about will touch on human sexuality and sexual violence. I wanted to give the audience a heads up about that. If that's an issue that's a little bit sensitive for you, if you're here with somebody who's younger and that you're not ready for that conversation, there's no judgment at all. If you want to duck out at any point, please feel free. We all have to kind of protect ourselves. Radical self-care is how we get through these days. I really shouldn't be here at all. If any of my earlier teachers, actually if any of my teachers could stand beside me, they would say, yeah, no, there's been a mistake in the programming. No, 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 no. I actually had a hard time learning how to read. And I succeeded in that only thanks to the good graces and incredible patience of public school teachers in Syracuse, New York, who pulled me out for extra reading support for several years, and also for the teachers who gave me speech therapy, because I was a child who lisped, which is such a terrible word. If you struggle to speak clearly, to describe what you have as a lisp is really cruel. English is a hard language, but they taught me more or less how to speak, and eventually I taught myself how to speak up, and therein the difference was made. I didn't really pay attention to class much. I had a short attention span and a vivid imagination, and I'm tall, so I got to sit in the back row all the time. Awesome. The one class I did pay attention to, interestingly enough, was history. I loved history class, I think because it was the experience of people, human beings that I could identify with. But I kind of had a bad attitude about English, literature, language arts as a child because I wasn't reading with my peer group. When I finally did catch up in late elementary school, then we quickly transitioned to middle school, and the slings and arrows of adolescence began to do their battle within my soul. I didn't connect with the books that we were reading in classrooms. And I can say, remember, I'm kind of old, but I never read a single assigned text in high school English class. That's why God made Cliff Notes. And it wasn't that I wasn't reading as a teenager. I was omnivorous in the library. I was constantly reading. But I can remember they handed me The Old Man and the Sea in 9th grade. Yeah, no, that was not speaking to my condition. And so it's just this delightful irony or God's sense of humor, for which she's well known, that I've wound up occupying this space as somebody who creates books and cares deeply about teenagers. My childhood was kind of happy, I bumbled along. I think not being able to read easily or quickly as a child really sensitized me to the needs of a lot of my readers today. When kids say, I hate to write, when kids say, I hate to read, I totally understand what they're talking about. What they're really trying to communicate to us is, I hate the way that trying to write makes me feel. I hate the way that trying to read makes me feel. Because if you're struggling with your skill set, and you're trying to write or read, and you're not feeling proficient, and you're getting judged and shamed instead of supported and lifted up, you feel stupid. And nobody likes to feel stupid, especially a kid who's already beginning to completely doubt their self-worth in the academic world. So but kind of bumbled along as a kid. When I became an adolescent, along with all the additional, usual adolescent challenges that came, my beloved father, who was a World War II veteran, he really kind of fell apart. Daddy was with the troops that got to Dachau shortly after it opened up. He was an 18-year-old boy from northern New York, whose ambition in life up until that point had been to own a gas station. And what my father saw in the people he was tasked to try to help at Dachau after the opening of the concentration camps never left him and turned him into a man who eventually wound up going to seminary at Boston University and becoming a United Methodist minister. My father felt deeply that he was called to love, and he had seen what hatred could do. And he felt called to operate out of a position of love. But he had such deep scars from his war experience that he had PTSD. And like so many of the greatest generation, they were forced to self-medicate. so many of our veterans are, because we don't offer them the resources that they need. And all that kind of came to a head when I was a teenager. It's this cruel thing, the way about our generational cycles, that generally as you, as an adult, have adolescence, your children hit their adolescence is when adults often hit pretty significant midlife crises, right? Everyone's freaking out about their bodies. The kids because hair is in awkward places and faces are breaking out, and adults because hair is in awkward places and and everything's a little bit south than it used to be. And there's tremendous psychological and emotional changes going on at the same time. So that was very puzzling to me as a kid. My father wound up leaving the church, which for a man as devoted as he was to the example of Jesus Christ was tantamount to a walking suicide. And so my adolescence was deeply colored by my father's traumas and the fact that we didn't talk about it. The fact that we didn't, even though my father was a counselor and a wise man, in my own house, we didn't talk about what happened after the ice cubes hit the bottom of the glass and the first shot of whiskey was poured. We didn't talk about the fact that we didn't bring friends home, or that daddy really could be scary and do scary things. And I think that confusion, that sense of what's happening to my family, why can't we talk about this, has never left me. As a teenager and as a young adult, that was pretty traumatic in its own right. As an adult who's now older than my dad was when we were going through this as a family, it's the greatest gift I was given. Because I think that ability to remember the confusions and the sorrows of adolescence has really given me an opportunity to hopefully write well for those kinds of kids. When my dad fell apart and my mother took on the added burden of being, kind of two parents at once and hopefully keeping us out of the poorhouse, that's when I crawled into literature for relief. That's when I started to write poetry for relief. I never, ever thought I would be an author, though. Because in my mind, authors, you read the bios on the back flap of a book. Nowadays, you have Twitter. Electricity hadn't been invented when I was a teenager, right? And all the authors that I admired, which back then were science fiction and fantasy authors, they were all dead. So there didn't seem to be much of a future in that. So I kind of, again, my path was a twisting path. Finding my voice was a strange and twisting path. I never thought ahead to, I'm going to be X one day. I spent most of my adolescence and young adult years wanting to just be alive the next morning and wanting my family to be okay. But kind of 20 years sometimes evaporated the way it does. And I found myself as a journalist. I somehow talked myself onto the staff of a couple different newspapers in Philadelphia area. And I found myself trying to write books for children, trying to write books for my own kids. I figured if Madonna could do it, right? How hard can it be? Princess Fergie, not exactly brain surgery we're talking about here. And it turns out that having not paid attention in English class did, in fact, turn around and bite me in the rear end. I was a dreadful combination when I started out writing of arrogance and ignorance, which is deadly if you're trying to achieve anything in your life. I really believe that the revision process had been designed to torture us. Arrogance, oh man. And I also thought that since little kids are kind of stupid, you didn't have to do a good job if you were writing picture books. So years of rejections ensued. We'll gloss over that. And eventually I figured out you actually have to do a draft and then revise it many, many times. And I was able to break down the barriers. And as it's a little bit of success writing picture books. And then my kids, this thing that children do if you feed and water them, they got bigger than me. And all of a sudden, instead of having my precious little girls, I had young women. I'll never forget the time my 6th grader walked down the stairs, and I swear to you, when she had gone to bed the night before, she looked like she was 11. And then she came down the next morning and she looked like she was 25. And I was like, oh no. Well, you know, I started to look up convent schools in Belgium I could send her to, because I knew that I was completely unprepared for the task of mothering her well, and I knew that the world was going to eat her alive. I was afraid of. I suspect it was my oldest kid's transition into adolescence and puberty and the joys of middle school that led to the writing of Speak. You know, when Stephanie was, who's a librarian now for the record, that one turned out great. When she was in 6th grade, we moved. She wasn't very happy with it. And a few months after we moved, she had started a new school, I woke up because I had a nightmare about a girl sobbing. And I thought, oh, shucks, Stephanie's upset again. So I went down to check on her, and she was sound asleep and no tears on the pillow. And I went back to bed, and I don't know if this happens to you guys. It's maybe a writer thing, but I have, my nightmares are usually recurrent. And I'll fall back asleep, and boy, it picks right up again. And what I've learned over the years is that if I write them down, they go away, so I can go to sleep. So I was really kind of grumpy. And I got up that night and I wrote what, after a lot of revision, became the opening pages of Speak. Speak is about 10% of my experience, because in the middle of all the family crisis that my father's breakdown caused, I was sexually assaulted at 13. And because of the chaos in my home, I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell anybody for 25 years, which is very, very common, very common. But when I wrote Speak, obviously I knew that had happened. I didn't want to write about my experience, so Speak wound up becoming, it's my emotional truth, although it's not the details of the attack and all that are quite different. And it wound up becoming kind of a personal manifesta, I guess, of me as a woman trying to find my voice. Finally having had enough years elapse from both my family breakdown and my own incident with sexual violence that I had some perspective and I could look back and begin to process what had happened to me. I never thought the book would be published. Never in a million years. And it was rejected. I got to point out for the new writers in the audience, I laminated that rejection letter after I was nominated for the National Book Award. And if I'm having a bad day, I pull that rejection letter out and I rub it on my arm and I say, see, they all make mistakes. When Speak was accepted for publication, though, again, you know, this book that I wrote to try to make sense of my own life, they assured me that nothing was going to happen with this book. My publisher went to great lengths to tell me, don't get your hopes up, lady. They said, this is 1999, it'll take 3 years to sell 3,000 copies and then it'll go out of print. And I was like, really? There's a lot of teenagers in America. Again, 1999, and this woman who left publishing shortly after, for the record, said, oh, we're not publishing this for teenagers because teenagers don't read. I said, why are you publishing this? She said, quote, teachers and librarians, they'll read anything. Yeah, right? So those were the expectations. And I think 1999, for anybody here who understands the field of young adult literature, that was the year of the perfect storm. That was the year that Walter Dean Myers published Monster. That was the first year that the American Library Association gave an award to young adult fiction. The demographics of the American teenager were such that the children of the baby boomers were now having teenagers of their own. And there was a community of English teachers who were moving beyond the canon of the dead white guys that I hated so much and beginning to look for books that they could put in the hands of their students that would speak to the condition of the adolescent heart, which is the journey of literature, isn't it? To open up the heart to the experience of all of us. So yeah, Speak sold more than 3,000 copies. Last time I checked, I think it's been translated into 32 languages. It's 3 million copies sold, something ridiculous like that. It's a standard in the curriculum. It's a standard on most censored book lists. And the reception of the book and reactions that I've had from readers has completely changed my life for the better. When you experiment with finding your own voice, there is no end to the bounty that brings to you. And I'm not talking about the fact that I was able to pay to put my kids through college, although thank you very much for that, Teachers and Librarians of America. I'm talking about being able to move from a shy, traumatized person into a place of power, where I could not only find that I had things to say, just the way that every single person in this room has things to say, but then I was able to learn how to better listen to other people and how to open my heart to the experiences of other people. Because when you've got your fists up, because you're in a position of defense instead of trusting in your voice and strength, and you're always just approaching the world like that, which is what I did for a good part of my life, you can't listen, you can't learn, and there's not much way people can get close to you. So finding my voice and having it validated is the greatest gift I've ever been given. I wanted to talk to you about a couple of things that my readers have taught me. And I should say before I go there that for some of you know that I also write books about history. Remember, I liked history class, and I was going to wear one of my Hamilton shirts up here and sing to you, but my voice is going and it's not very good to start with, so I figured that would be bad. But if you look at, because people often go like, what, you write history books? Or if they like my books about the American Revolution, they go, what, you write YA? What my books have in common, though, is I write books without even planning. This is the way it's worked out. I write books that are about things that people struggle to talk about. I write books about the elephant in the room: sexual violence, bullying, eating disorders, PTSD, social injustice, racial injustice, America's history of slavery, things that people often squirm about. When I talk about my books about the American Revolution that look at the American Revolution through the eyes of children from the North held in slavery, I can often, when I'm speaking to all white audiences, largely white audiences, you can see people go, oh, and like someone will raise their hand and say, can we please talk about eating disorders? Because that's a little bit easier to talk about than racial injustice. I'm the queen of the elephant in the room. When you guys make me a crown, that's what I want in the front. I want a big old elephant. And that reflects back on me as a kid, when the world turned upside down and I was so confused about how do we talk about these things that nobody seems to want to talk about. That's the beginning of finding a voice. The adolescent search for identity is a search for voice. And it's baffling as a parent or as an adult who's in love, has this passion and love for these kids who are so amazing and horrifying and terrifying and bewildering, because from minute to minute they change, right? I used to wish so badly that they would make like mood rings that you could put on my kids' foreheads, so I would know when they walked in the kitchen which version of my daughter had just walked in the kitchen, because it could be the daughter who wanted to pull the big knife from the drawer, or the daughter who wanted to crawl onto my lap. And I often didn't figure that out till way too late. But I know that my kids, just like I, and just like every teenager I've ever met, they have to try on different versions of themselves. They have to test their voice, often loudly, often with language that makes their grandparents cringe. But that's part of their search. And sadly, we have created a culture where that voice is often smashed, where kids get too quickly learn the message that you are valued not by what you have to say, but by the brand of clothing that you're wearing. Or can you fit into this easily understandable box that we can then label? And for, even kids who are coming from families that are really doing well emotionally, depending on what's going on in their lives, so many of them go adrift. I've had this really fascinating conclusion recently about why YA literature is read by not only so many millions and millions of teenagers in America, but also by adults. We all know, everybody in this room knows an adult who's in pain, who is struggling with chronic pain in their life, emotional pain. And it has to do with something that happened when they were a teenager or a child. And we don't have the kind of integrity in our culture set up so that when things go wrong in the lives of teenagers, they feel surrounded, supported, and loved enough that they can turn to the adults in their lives and in their community. And so what happens is, instead of finding their voice, they feel, I'm being silenced. They don't turn to somebody. And the wounds become scars, the scars become infected, and what could have been an amazing, wonderful, happy, grounded human being turns into somebody who often is self-harming in all kinds of different ways, turns into an adult who's angry, who's bitter, who's lost, and who then goes ahead and has children. And the cycle continues. So I think adults are reading YA fiction, and I know adults are reading YA fiction, because it gives so many of us the ability to go back to when things went wrong, that time in our lives, and revisit it from an adult perspective, hopefully a better, healthier perspective, and we can go, oh, hopefully we can forgive ourselves. If my Father will allow me, forgive the trespasses of those who have trespassed against us. Maybe do some healing and move forward. But I don't want any teenager to have to wait that long. I want teens to be able to have a robust body of literature that will allow them to find themselves, sometimes mirrored in the book. Rudine Sims Bishop, that brilliant librarian, teacher of librarians, who gave us the analogy of books offer for children mirrors and windows, mirrors into their own experience, windows into the experience of others. The best compliment I get from teens is, thank you for telling the truth. Thank you for being honest. My favorite letter from Speak, I've had tens of thousands of communications from people who read Speak. A woman in her 80s who was raped as a 12-year-old by some boys at her school, and whose parents married her off to the next traveling salesman who came through town. And she said, my life began when he died, when she was in her 60s. Just every variety, not only of people who have been victimized by sexual violence, but people who have been silenced for whatever reason. But one of my favorite letters that I got about Speak came from a cheerleader in Idaho, who spent the first page taking me to task because I'm a wee bit disrespectful of cheerleaders. I don't think it's a sport, I'm sorry. And she explained why I was so wrong about that. But on page 2, she said, I wanted you to know that your book changed me, because there'd always been this girl in my school who's kind of, as she put it in the book, the letter, the weird girl. And she sits alone at lunch. And after I read your book, I realized that maybe there was something going on in her life. And that's why she was being a little bit isolated. So I sat down with her at lunch one day, and I talked to her, and we have nothing in common. But she said, as long as I'm in that school, she's never going to sit alone at lunch again. That's the power of story. That's the power of voice, because stories connect us, one heart to the next. What I've learned over Speak's been out for, 18 years now. How am I doing on time? Yep. Almost 18 years. Next February, which will be 19 years, we're bringing out a graphic novel version of Speak, which I think is going to be really interesting. I did the script for that. And it's been, I'm angry that the book is still needed. I'm angry that we're still talking about rape culture. I'm enraged that rape culture has gotten worse in America. We can talk about it a little bit more than we did when Speak came out in 1999, but the availability of pornography on the internet, the rise of binge drinking, the visibility of very, very privileged men in America who get to brag about sexually assaulting women. And let's not forget that men are also victims of sexual assault, men and boys. And when people have power and they brag about that, they give permission to other people to try. We still lie to ourselves that most of the people who commit violence, sexual violence, are the bad guys in the bushes with a gun. Over 80% of the people who commit acts of sexual violence are known to the victim and are often quite close to the victim. So you have a victim who's traumatized not only by the violence, but whose trust has been broken, shattered, often irreparably. One of the things that I think we can do as a culture, particularly as a culture of adults though, is to take a deep breath and reach for our own voices. I seriously doubt there are more than 2 or 3 people in this room who grew up having open, honest conversations about human sexuality with their parents. That instruction is often left to the side of the tampon box or a crass remark, son, don't hurt any girls, that'll be it. Or maybe a school video or an awkward presentation by somebody, who's very earnest but has no connection to the students coming in from domestic violence committees and things like that. Sexual intimacy is one of the most important parts of being a human being. Our kids are literally dying because we lack the courage to talk to them about human sexuality. And I mean talking not only to our daughters, but to our sons. Our sons don't know the rules of the road. When I first started to travel around America and talk about Speak to schools, I had this incident happen over and over again. It was so enlightening. Usually it's funny, when Speak first came out and was beginning to be adopted into curriculum, it was first adopted into curriculum at the end of 12th grade because school boards and English departments said, our kids are going out into the wide world. We should probably acknowledge that this sexual violence happens, and we'll do it when they're almost 18. Now it's usually taught at the end of 8th grade, or at summer reading between 8th and 9th, which is appropriate and a sad reflection of how much sexual violence happens to victims who are younger than 15 years old. But I started to talk to classes, and I would get this response from young men, usually lacrosse players in the back of the room, who towards the end of my presentation would raise their hands and say, Miss, thanks for writing the book. It was way better than Scarlet Letter. So I was like, yes, I hated that book. And then the boy would ask this question that came from the best, most poignant place of naivete and ignorance. And he would say, I liked it, but I didn't understand why she was so upset. And the girls in the front row would turn their heads and go, what? And you knew he was never dating any girl in that class. But it was, and I at first was very judgmental too and wanted to say, son, I need to talk to your mother. But I started to ask questions. I started to listen to their voices. I started to interview boys. And they told me what they were learning. And his rationale, their rationale, because I got this from boys in every demographic, in every kind of school district, rural, urban, suburban, anywhere across the country. It wasn't a bad guy in the bushes with a gun. It didn't take that long. And it was a high, in the book, the boy who commits a sexual assault has a lot of prestige. So it's kind of good for her to be seen with him. And I learned, because I talked to these boys and listened to them, that's what they're being told. They're not being told what consent means. They're not being told what informed consent means. They're just being told, run with it, so, go for it. You're not a rapist. She didn't say no. They're not told that you need to have ongoing, enthusiastic, sober yes. We are failing our children. We are failing our children because our parents, frankly, failed us. But it's our responsibility to acknowledge that, to recognize that we weren't taught how to talk about these hard things, and that 1 out of 5 Americans being victimized, being a victim of sexual assault, is inexcusable. We are failing our sons and our daughters. We must find our voices. What I've learned, having had many, many, many awkward conversations over the course of my life, is that the first thing to do is to say, this is so hard to talk about. I feel my stomach is clenching. I kind of want to puke. I would rather talk about anything right now. And you only have to say that a couple times as these conversations come up until it becomes a normal conversation. The way we teach, I had this great conversation when I was in Qatar. I was in Doha, Qatar, a couple of years ago, speaking at the American school there. And a lot of the Qataris sent their kids to the American school. And a number of the parents, very conservative Muslim community, were not comfortable with me being there. So they asked to have a private meeting with me. It was all moms. And I talked about our responsibility as parents to teach our children not to run into traffic when they're children. And we all are agreed on that. And I said, but then when our kids get to be tall enough to look us in the eye, it's even more important that we start talking to them about things that affect the rest of their lives, like sexual violence. And that was one of my favorite audiences in the entire, those women were incredibly generous, and they listened, and we had a great mom conversation. So almost out of time here. There are more conversations about consent now. For those of you looking, Stephen Colbert, it was John Williams, did a great piece on The Daily Show a while back where he talked about the analogy of the boxing ring. And that if you walk up to somebody in a bar, in a movie theater, in a church, and you punch them in the face, you get arrested, usually, one hopes, and tried, and there's adjudication. But if you're in a boxing ring, and you both agree to be in the boxing ring, and you have the right safety equipment on, you're supposed to wail at each other, and everyone claps, right? And then he went on to compare that to the need to get sober, ongoing consent for a sexual activity. It's the same thing. And so there's all these different ways now that we're beginning to kind of creep into the conversations. But they're still not happening often enough. They're not frank enough. And literally our children are dying because we lack the courage to use our voices and to listen to theirs. I am one of the most censored people in America. My father used to tell me when people call me a pornographer or try to pull my books off of the shelves, I should write them thank you notes because it increases book sales. My mom didn't like it though when they would call me a pornographer. I've wound up becoming somebody who talks a lot about censorship, which is kind of the opposite of finding your own voice, isn't it? I think that parents have not only the right, but the obligation to be aware of what their kids are reading and consuming in popular culture. But there's no other parent in the world who has the right to decide for my child. And we have to be really clear about what are the limits on parental interference into things like public education, and what are the responsibilities of people in education to be sensitive to the needs of their audiences. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say. I want to leave time for a couple of questions. It's been about 18 years, it's been about 20 years since I woke up and had a nightmare. The nightmare that led me to find my own voice and to write this book. I think that maybe sometimes we give our kids the wrong messages because we're always telling kids to follow your dreams, right? I've learned that paying attention to your nightmares can be very instructive as well. Because if you know what makes you afraid at night, if you know what ghosts from the past are dogging you and waking you up and haunting your sleep, and you can find yourself a good community where you feel safe and strong enough to begin to look those ghosts in the eye, to find your voice and speak up about what you've been through, that's ultimately probably the most empowering thing you can do for yourself. And I urge you all to try. So, who's bold and brave and has a couple questions for me right there?
I'm interested in what you think about the new
Oh, yeah. If you don't want people to say negative things about your books, you shouldn't try to get published. I stopped Googling myself about 8 years ago. Best thing ever. I don't read reviews. There's not a darn thing I can do about it. Because here's the thing: reading reviews is like chasing that really good-looking guy in the cafeteria who honestly doesn't know you exist. And if he looks at you, you feel like really, really good. But if he doesn't look at you, you feel like terrible. And it never has anything to do with you. Everybody's allowed to not like a book. Everyone's allowed to take me to task for things that I did or that they made up, whatever. It's, so don't read the book. I don't care. I have pretty strong opinions about books, too. You should go on my Goodreads page and read the review I just posted a little while ago about Barbara Ehrenreich's Nickeled and Dimed, which is a book coming from a poor background you'd think I'd love, and I hated it. And I flogged that book. But it's all good. It's all good. Yes?
So, in light of what you're saying about supporting our kids and our adolescents, and we're at a UU church, are you familiar with the OWL program?
Owl? No.
UU churches that seem to teach a great deal. I don't know that much about it. I thought you might.
No, because I grew up in the church, I don't attend. I grew up in the sausage factory. I saw the sausage get made. It's not fun. I do love Jesus, but don't find him in church very much.
It's supposed to be very supportive for adolescents of the issues you're talking about, and it's UU.
Yeah, and I think parents need supporting through their kids' adolescence as much as kids need supporting. I think the best thing we can do for each other, when you see people who have teenage children and you can tell them because they look tired, just kind of pat them on the back. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. I'm going to write a parenting book one of these days because I learned a lot from my readers. I think that I became a much better mother because of my readers. And without my readers, I would have turned into that middle-class, very aggressive mom who pushed her kids to achieve academically, because that was what I thought was going to lead to their success and happiness in life. And honestly, my standards I lowered my standards to the point that I told my kids, I would prefer it if you don't do anything that's going to put you in jail. But if you wind up in jail, we can at least deal with that as a family, but you cannot die. You cannot die. Adolescence is hard. Some kids get through it okay, and that's awesome. That's amazing. I actually feel a little bit more, obviously, attracted and sensitive to the ones who are struggling for whatever reason, and there's 8 million reasons. It doesn't have to do with your wealth or anything. That adolescence can be a really rocky place for kids. And I think that too often the culture around us, has us kind of beating our kids around the head, feeling like they have to go to Harvard to be successful human beings, when really what they need is us just to love them ridiculously and accept them for all their attitudes and warts and mistakes and scuffed knees and smelly hair. And just love them as abundantly as we loved them when they were 5. It's not their job to make us happy. Other questions? Yeah.
So obviously you had to have a lot of discussions with adults and teenagers about the content of Speak, and I haven't read the book.
Yeah. You should.
And I'm curious, I think one of the pressures for any person, whether teenage or adult, who's been sexually assaulted is the pressure that they get from those who are close to them, since usually the perpetrator is someone that they know well, is what are the consequences going to be for that family relationship? Or that friend
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
if you speak out? And what is to be gained by speaking out?
Right.
If somehow you've reconciled it for yourself or for someone who's close to you, why do you have to speak out so that that perpetrator must deal with the consequences of that choice, and what are the ramifications for their life in the long run? And that is a huge responsibility to be burdened with when you think, if I speak, what will the consequences be for that person?
And while I hear what you're saying, and I've come across that I've come across that frequently. I think, I think that part of this is our Puritan heritage, frankly, speaking as a Yankee, because you go to Europe, they can talk about sex much easier than we can. And I think if you peel away sexual from the phrase sexual violence, and imagine, for example, a scenario where there's a victim who's victimized by a sexual assault, and the perpetrator is somebody that this person knows. Don't view it as sexual violence. If that perpetrator had come up to the victim, let's say with a 2x4, right? A big hefty 2x4, and cracked that person across the face with the 2x4 publicly, there would be no discussion ever about, what are the consequences of the family relationships? It would be, get that son of a gun in jail. Get the police here. Let's have an investigation. Get the district attorney. That was a public act of violence. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about violence. But because we're coming out of a patriarchal culture with how many hundreds of years of men owning women's bodies, shaming women's bodies, women feeling as if their only value comes because they look a certain way at a certain age, and giving teenage boys and men and old men the excuse of testosterone, or boys will be boys, or she was wearing a skirt, or whatever, giving them those excuses. This is all garbage and is completely meaningless. Whenever you see someone's been a victim of sexual assault, I want you to have the image in your head of that person getting clocked in the face by a 2x4. It was an act of violence. End of discussion. How do?
When you were in Dakar,
Oh, in Doha. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We had fascinating conversations about that. And you think that within our culture, there's a lot of sexual violence. What I heard privately, and I've heard this from other, because I come from a church background, I often speak to very conservative communities, even though we don't always see eye to eye in scripture. I understand the approach to life. And you think it's hard within kind of a liberal community to talk about these things. Within conservative communities, specifically conservative religious communities, regardless of the faith, it's almost impossible. Because to speak up is to challenge every aspect of that community's reason for being, which is why it happens so often. I think so. I think that there were conversations. I can think of specifically some families where there were conversations where there hadn't been conversations before. Any other quick questions? Then we're out. Real quick, yeah. Mm. Yeah. Right. Oh, I think popular culture is responding to this need. The Speak movie came out in 2003. Kristen Stewart was the main actress before Twilight, thank goodness. And I think there's many different ways now, many different doors. Some of Beyonce's amazing music videos, female empowerment. I mean, she really owns some of that and allows girls and women, Lady Gaga in some cases, to take charge of their bodies and to be strong and empowered and have their voice. So I think there's room for more of it, and there's room for more books about all of these important issues. I hope everybody goes home and starts writing your story. Thank you very much. You want me to scoot down there?
Yes, please. I thought you all might be interested in knowing that thanks to both your support and a generous grant from the Community Foundation for Nantucket that we just found out about yesterday, Laurie will be back on Nantucket in October to talk to our middle school and high school students. So we look forward to that.
Also, for any educators or homeschooling parents in the audience, there's teacher guides up here up front if you're interested.
So, Laurie's heading down that way. If you'd like a book signed, you can follow her. And if you're not getting a book signed today, you can exit out the side. And thank you for being here today.